Hello, I'm Mark Winberry, Senior Director of U.S. Operations for Pronovix, and I want to give you a hearty welcome to this fifth event of the API the Docs virtual series. This event replaces the live event that was originally scheduled to be held in Portland. That was going to have real people sitting beside each other, lots of talking face-to-face, having chats over coffee, and without wearing masks. Yeah, that would have been cool, right? But we adapt and move forward. With that, I'd like to give a hearty welcome to our speakers today, Joan James from Zebra Technologies and Tom Johnson from Amazon. I'm really excited for you to share your presentations with us today. There are 4 parts on the schedule for this event. First, we're going to hear from Joan. Second, Tom will present to us. Third, we'll have a brief Q&A where I'll pose questions to Tom and Joan together, panel style. And finally, we're going to have 5 breakout unconference sessions that are held separately from Crowdcast. These were organized in the API the Docs Conferences Slack channel virtual unconference. 2 of the 5 topics have been pre-selected as follow-on discussions from the topics our speakers opened up to us. The first is Open API Spec Experiences and the skill set for API documentation. Now, if you have ideas for any of the other 3 breakout sessions, please propose them in the virtual unconference Slack channel. Google Meet URLs will be posted in the Slack channel as each group forms up during the talks. Also, even though this is a virtual conference, there's still opportunity to interact with each other on Slack and in the Google Meet afterwards. So we do have a code of conduct that we've borrowed from the Write the Docs community. That is, please be friendly, be respectful, and be careful with the words you choose. If you observe behavior or feel that someone is violating that and you want to inform us about it, please send an email to info@apithedocs.org. Now I'd like to make a plea and an announcement. As you know, API the Docs is sponsored by Pronovix and is not for profit. This year, despite going virtual, we do have a lot of costs invested in this event. And our motto at Pronovix is grow and help grow, which is why we host this event. So if you can, please help support API the Docs. You'll see a button below that just came on screen. And please click on it and find out how you can become a supporter of this group. Again, this is not for profit. It's to offset the cost of the tools and such that we're using. Now for the announcement. The reception of this virtual conference has been so great that I'd like to announce that we're planning on holding a second set of API the Docs virtual events that we're calling Season 2, and that's going to begin in September. We're also planning to host the Dev Portal Awards this year, which will probably be virtual as well. So watch your newsletter for more information about those. The call for talk proposals for the API Virtual Season 2 opens on June the 10th. So if you've been inspired by the presentations that you've heard previously or the ones you hear today, and you'd like to share your experiences and learnings with this community, please consider submitting a talk proposal. Now I'd like to say hello and welcome to Joan James, API Technical Writer at Zebra Technologies. Hi, Joan. One of the things I like about your talk is how you underscore the importance of naming. Now, I have a really bad reputation for naming, and I kind of think of myself as the notorious BNG. That's a notorious bad name giver. But I also know that having good names is super important, and your talk speaks to that. So as we listen to your talk and consider all of the things about API design that you're going to share with us, and the dog starts barking or the kids interrupt us, what's the one takeaway that you want us to make? You want to make sure that we don't miss during your presentation?
I think thank you for asking me that question. After many years of software development and a career gap, for me, it was a nice change from what I was doing, but yet I was able to make use of my life experience. And I think there's a lot of other people out there like me that made career changes for a variety of reasons. And working closely with the developers is a comfort zone for me. And I know many of my former coworkers who've gone on to other temporary professions, they probably feel the same way because we grew up in that environment. So I think somebody like that could be effective in a role like this, either in a role like this or a mentor for other API technical writers.
All right, thank you for that. And now we're going to play your talk, and then we'll hear from Tom afterwards.
Good morning. My name is Joan James, and I'm here today to present my topic of how the Open API spec led to better API design. I want to thank API the Docs for inviting me to speak today. I wish we could do this in person, but maybe sometime in the future. Before I begin, a little bit about my background. I have about 3 parts to my career. I started off out of college as a software engineer at Motorola Cellular Infrastructure Division in Schaumburg, Illinois. I was there for 20 years as a developer and later as a requirements engineer working on requirements for 3G core networks. When my son was about 10 years old, I became a stay-at-home mom. I went back to school. I was a part-time teacher. I taught piano lessons. I did all sorts of kid-friendly things. When the time came for my son to go to college, I returned to the corporate world, and I went right back to Motorola, where I was doing technical writing for 4G, public safety, LTE. Eventually, I wound up at Zebra, and somewhere along the way, I started reading about API documentation, and I thought, this sounds like something I'd like to do. So I started educating myself on API documentation and Swagger in particular. So this is where my Zebra journey begins. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Zebra technology, so I'll just give you a little bit of background about it. You might know Zebra from barcode technology, maybe at your grocery store. There's a barcode scanner there made by Zebra. They also make RFID readers. They make mobile devices. They have locationing solutions. And now we have REST APIs enabling the cloud. Zebra Savannah is the enterprise platform that cloud enables Zebra. This is how we have connected devices used for communicating with the device and also for storing information about the device in the data platform. The developer portal gives access to our cloud APIs. Taking a closer look at the developer portal, besides API documentation, we have blogs, we have case studies, we have support services, learning services, and all kinds of things to complement the APIs. And you can find that at developer.zebra.com. Drilling down a little more on the API documentation. Why do we have API documentation? API documentation is there to instruct the audience. It provides an overview of the API. It has use cases. It has descriptions of every call and parameter. We have to remember to address all types of audiences. There's developers, but there's all kinds of developers. There's internal developers, external developers, newcomers. There's debuggers, system architects, people who make decisions about using the API. This particular API on this page is one of our free APIs you might be interested in trying. It's called UPC Lookup. So if you got something sitting around on your desk, like maybe this bottle of water, you can plug in the UPC code in there and find out about it. You can find out lots of things about that bottle of water. It's pretty interesting, I think. And I wanted to say that page on the top is the part that's generated from the Open API spec. There's lots of other types of API documentation solutions that are around there, but the one that we chose was the Open API spec. The Open API spec is for REST APIs. It's a standard that was developed around 10 years ago and eventually became owned by the Smart Bear company. It was called Swagger originally. It's a language agnostic interface for RESTful APIs. You might have heard the word Swagger used in reference to tools because the Swagger spec was taken over by the Open API initiative, and they changed the name to the Open API spec so as not to confuse it with the tool set that Smart Bear offers that has the word Swagger in it. It's a machine-readable API definition. It's represented in either YAML or JSON format. The latest version is 3.0. The benefits of using the Open API spec is that it can be the single source of truth for your API structure. That's not always the case because of the way that the spec is sometimes generated, but it's a good place to have the single source of truth, but that's something you have to work out with your organization. The developers provide the descriptions in the Open API spec. In my case, I had to review those descriptions and I had to change them. I attempted to change the descriptions in the code in one case, but that didn't always work out really well because of the tools that were used to generate the Open API spec were not really very good. The Open API spec is an API-first design enabler, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more later. It's a stable implementation. As I said, it's been around for 10 years. There's numerous tools available based on the Open API spec. There's editors, there's plugins, there's code generators, there's mocking tools, all sorts of things. There's different types of rendering engines. So why do we want API-first design? Now that we have the Open API spec before any code is developed, we can provide some type of governance on this spec. Well, you might ask, how could this be done? In my case at Zebra, I am part of the API management team, which is comprised of a product manager, a program manager, the developer portal owner, and the engineers that develop the proxies on the Apogee platform. We all learned about the Open API spec together. The team is very supportive of my role, which has helped me gain the trust of the API developers. So let's explore the API management process a little bit more and see how does that work. How can we get feedback on the Open API spec before any code is written? Now, that I will say that this is not exactly what our process looks like, but this is somewhat of a goal. The entrance criteria for the API management process is the Open API spec. What we want to do is have some type of a customized linter. We don't have such a thing now, but we have certain requirements that have been done to the Open API spec before we begin any type of work on it. We're in the process of developing a naming requirement before we do anything with the spec. And by naming, I mean the name of the API product and the base path URL name. Because as you will find out, as I found out, the more APIs you have, the more you realize that you should have had a master plan on the naming of your URLs, your base path, as they would call it in the Open API spec. So once we have our Open API spec, the developers can develop in parallel. And then as you go from one phase to the other, you can have test criteria for your code. You can have test criteria for your Open API spec, because remember, once you post that spec and it's rendered on your developer portal, there's a button to try it out. And the developers, I found out, they don't really care about that button because they know that somebody's going to be writing code to call that REST API. And so I've had to enforce testing of the documentation. So we're treating the Open API spec as though it were code. In this first bubble here, we have the developers developing, perhaps me, the API documentation person. I'm gathering inputs for what we call supplemental documentation that enhances the API documentation that comes from the spec. Before we release it publicly, we have final reviews of all the documentation, and the developers have their own final testing that's done, and there's a whole checklist of things they have to go through. Taking a closer look at the Open API spec, I mentioned that it was a contract, but you know, I'm a musician, I'm a piano teacher. I also think of this like an orchestra score. You know, everybody thinks that with the concept of agile and minimum viable product and all that, there's a lot of developers who want to code first and have their minimum viable product because that's the way they've been taught to do their development. But if you think about it, what if you had an orchestra? I live near Chicago. What if the Chicago Symphony Orchestra showed up and the musicians all just sat down and played whatever they wanted? Or maybe a few of them got together, 3 or 4 of them, and they agreed what they were going to do, and they all came together. And then, well, let's just write the music down later. Well, that's not going to work, right? So I think of this as another analogy of a contract. It's an agreement between multiple parties that they're going to march to the same drummer. So what if there are problems in the spec? And this is where I got on my journey of teaching myself REST API and best practices and trying to promote it within Zebra. So what kind of problems, you might ask? The URL structure. Suppose their APIs are very similar to someone else's APIs, but their URL structure is completely different. What if they use a different method of versioning? There's all kinds of ways that you can version. You can put a version in the path. You can put it in a query parameter. You could do some type of negotiation. What if they're doing it in a completely different way as the rest of the company? Resource naming. That is the part of the path that comes after your fully qualified domain name. And you need to have a master plan for resource naming, and you need to know some basic rules about the resource naming. Like, for example, you shouldn't put a verb in the resource name. It should be nouns in most cases. The parameter names, you want to have consistent parameter naming, like from one API to another. If you're talking about the same thing, you want to use the same word. Also, you want to have conventions for naming so that the user finds it easy to guess if you left something out. They say, oh, well, Zebra did it this way before, so maybe it means this or that because that's the way they've always done it. Then there's how you use headers. You need to have agreement on the use of headers. The error responses should be documented. They should be used in the same way. You don't want to use a silly response code because you think it's cute, okay? You want to use the standard ones. Then there's authentication. You want to have agreement on what type of scenarios you'll use, what type of authentication. So at Zebra, we had a handbook, a design handbook for REST APIs, and someone created it when we started on the journey of cloud APIs. And it was a very good tutorial, but it didn't have these kinds of things in there. Like, how do you name parameters? I can't tell you how many email threads I've been involved in where people were discussing parameter naming. It's so easy to just say, this is the way we're going to do it, and have everyone do the same thing. So we had an architect team that had a process of submitting problem statements and success criteria for problem statements. So the Scrum team that I was working with suggested that I create a problem statement for the architect team. So I did. I took the problem statement, it included many of the things I already mentioned, and I presented it to the architecture team. And we put together a task group that met twice a week for about a month, and we addressed all the issues in our problem statement. And most of these people were API designers and architects, and me, the technical writer. Now, I've been a developer before. The people on this team didn't know that. The technology has changed since I was a developer, but there are many things that are still the same. Like, I didn't use Git when I was a developer, but I used something that was similar, so I kind of knew what it was. I kind of knew how it worked. That's for example. So what I did was, I was more like a facilitator, and I was the person that updated the document. So this is very similar to being a technical writer. You know, you meet with your subject matter experts and you update documents, right? So what I did is I chose topics for each person on the team, and they would present some ideas and some of their research on the topic at hand. Present it to the rest of the group, and everyone discussed it. I recorded the meetings, and I helped them come to a consensus. And then I documented it. I also presented a topic, and my topic was my favorite topic, parameter naming. This is the one that really got me. When you are the technical writer and you are updating the Open API spec, mainly what you're doing is you're updating titles and summaries and descriptions, but you don't touch the stuff that has to match the code. So I never felt like I was able to change the parameter names, but I saw many parameter names that were not very good. For example, a single letter. Now, when I was a developer and I worked with microprocessors, memory was a concern, but I don't think memory is necessarily a concern now for a parameter name. I mean, surely you can afford 8 characters for a parameter name. Another one that got me was prepositions for parameter names. When I tried to write a description about the to parameter, I ended up having the word to twice in a row, and it was very difficult to describe the to parameter. Just so happens in that particular case, I was able to open up a bug ticket on Jira for the naming of the parameter. And the developers were very, very happy to take my recommendations. I was very surprised. And so we fixed that problem. And it kind of empowered me a little bit. So this was my contribution. Well, one of my contributions to the task force is parameter naming. And I did a lot of research. Stack Overflow was a good source for me. I looked at Google. I looked at lots of different websites that were recommended to me, API developer websites. So the query parameter, what we decided was the query parameter would be camel case. And I ran into a lot of, not a lot, but a few people who questioned that. But the reasoning was, now you may have a server that isn't case sensitive, but usually you have an agreement with the other party that's using your API on this parameter. So camel case is okay for the query parameter, which comes at the end of the endpoint. And no one is ever going to type that in. The problem with having mixed case in the fully qualified domain name is that people might just type it in. It's not necessarily generated by software. And so they're going to have a tendency to misuse the case. But no one's ever going to type in, or they shouldn't type in, the query parameter manually. The path parameter is part of the URL. And the path parameter is often contains like some type of a key for a database, for example. I have an example elsewhere about collections of pets. So let's say you have the pet ID is part of the path parameter. And the naming of that is only for documentation, because the actual ID becomes part of the path. And I forgot to mention that query parameters tend to be like a filter or something like that when you're filtering out the results. The header parameters, you don't have a lot of leeway on the naming of the header parameters because you have to have agreement with that on with the server on that one. The body parameters are also for documentation only. And I have a famous quote here that I've heard from developers. The 2 hardest things in computer science is cache invalidation and naming things, which was supposedly said by someone named Phil Carlton. I hear maybe he doesn't exist, or maybe he never said that, but I think it's a good quote. Another thing that we had to agree on was HTTP status codes. And the list I have here are the ones that we felt were the most common. The server errors are not something that you want to happen. And this may be a matter of personal choice, but I don't document the 500 error code because that's something that you want to perform some type of root cause analysis, and don't release the software with an error like that. And I would think that by documenting that, you're saying that it might happen, which is not a good thing. If it did happen, I think it's easy to look it up and know what it is. What I found is in the Open API spec very often that these status codes are missing, and they should be there if they're possible. Other aspects that need agreement are versioning. As I mentioned before, there's lots of different ways to do versioning. Headers, I'm not really going to talk about all the different types of headers. The use of methods. I'll give you an example about methods. In our documentation, we tend to use what they call the CRUD verbs when describing the methods. That would be change, retrieve, update, or delete. Resource naming, there's different approaches to resource naming. This is a whole subject unto itself. You could give an entire presentation on resource naming. And for REST APIs, it's very important to do this the right way. And it's also very helpful to the users of your APIs, because once you have good resource naming, they're going to know what to do. You're going to know what to do with the HTTP method types. If you try to put verbs in the resource name, then people have to learn what your verbs are. They don't automatically know how to do a get or a post or whatever. The other thing about method types is that you would want consistency on is there are some developers that have a tendency to want to do something like this. They do a get with a request body. Why would you have a request body? You would get a response body back. And the reason that they're doing that is because for some reason they don't want to use a query string or a path parameter because they think that it's not protected. So that's why people do things like that. But the problem with that is that the tools sometimes won't accept that in your Open API spec. So it's just not really a good thing to do. Authentication, I mentioned already. And also you want to have an attitude among your developers that using REST best practices is a good thing. And I found, by surprise, I found out that most people really wanted to do it the right way, and they wanted to learn more about it. And everybody comes from a different place and has a different type of knowledge about it, and nobody knows it all. We're all learning it together. So I found that helped me to work with the developers on this. So if I had to do this all over again, of course, you know what they say about hindsight. Here's some of the things I would do. So if you're thinking about having your very first developer portal, maybe you'll benefit from this, but you want to establish the API naming early. When we first started working on this, we only had, 1 or 2 or 3 APIs. It didn't seem like a big deal. Also, the resource URL naming, for example, pet store, animals, dogs, that type of thing. You want to have some kind of a master plan, especially for the first word, that word pet store. Establishing parameter naming conventions is also a good thing to do first. And after going through this for a year, it was a year ago when I first became a member of the API management team, more than ever, I convinced myself that API first design is a really worthy goal. If you're just getting started with the Open API spec, here are some resources that you might want to use. I found some really excellent classes on LinkedIn, and they keep getting better all the time. A year ago, there weren't so many. Now there's lots of them. They're all really good. I've been reading a lot of books. Generally, the ones that are the most recent are the best. But, you might find an older book that has a really good description of resource naming. So that's something to consider too. And tools that work with the Open API spec, one of them that's really popular right now is Stoplight. Then there's a lot of tools that have the word Swagger in them that are also out there. I want to thank you again for inviting me today. I hope that you will all look for me on LinkedIn. And I look forward to meeting you hopefully someday at an API The Docs session. Maybe it'll be in Chicago, I hope. Thank you.
Now I can see that there's hope for the notorious B and G. If you have questions for Tom or Joan, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the Crowdcast screen, and I'll be asking questions to them after Tom's presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce Tom Johnson, a senior technical writer for Amazon, and someone who's been giving back to the community through his blog, I'd Rather Be Writing, for many years now. Now, Tom, you started your career as a writing teacher and came to technical writing after that. And we know that many technical writers are developers first and writers second, and some write just because they have to. And thinking about your presentation, is there some aspect of your formal teacher writing training and experience that you wish that all technical writers had, no matter where they're coming from?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked this question because it exposes my humanities background, right? I majored in English, got a master's in creative writing, and I thought I wanted to maybe just teach writing. And I realized a couple of years into it that I actually really did not like grading. Grading was torture. And I wasn't a very good teacher. I'd rather just do the writing myself, be the writer. So I switched over into technical writing. But I've found that, like, as I work with dev portals and lots of other engineering teams contributing content, I'm not always doing the writing. I'm acting a lot of times as an editor, not too unlike that former writing teacher with a bunch of papers to grade, right? Only this time I don't have to give them a B or A minus, but I add comments, right? And so this background as a writing teacher has helped me be a better editor. I've sort of learned to recognize what's important, what I should just leave alone, even if I don't, even if I would write it differently, it's not worth commenting. Focusing on the things that matter and communicating them in a way that doesn't like offend or upset the original writer.
That's really good advice, and thank you. Now we're going to switch over and hear your presentation, or see your presentation and hear your presentation, and then we'll get back together for the panel Q&A session. So if you have questions, please use the Ask a Question button, and I'll look through the questions that I've been writing down and come back to Tom and Joan with those questions. So with that, Adam, roll film.
Hi, my name is Tom Johnson, and today I'm going to talk about how trends in API documentation differ from other TechCom trends. At the turn of the year, back in December, I was kind of sitting around thinking that I wanted to write a post about trends, and I was trying to come up with what to say. And I started looking at what other research had been done around trends. What had people already written? And I looked at existing surveys. There was a TechCom census by Saul Carliner that was very extensive across the broad TechCom industry. Another really good survey by Scott Abel, a benchmarking survey. But I was a little frustrated by some of the results in these trends. It looked like the picture that these trends painted didn't seem to square with the trends I was seeing in the developer doc space. For example, the trends indicated that 76% of people used Word or Google Docs, that 31% used help authoring tools or HATs, that 30% used FrameMaker, that 20% were using a component content management system, 14% using Data. And I was like, I just am not seeing this in other tech pubs groups that are creating documentation for developers. And I wondered, how do the trends differ? And has anybody ever surveyed just this segment of the population? So I decided to create a survey of my own, focusing only on developer documentation. That is, people who are writing documentation that is intended primarily for developers, engineers, or the sort. I had 50 questions in the survey. It took people about 9 to 10 minutes to complete. They were mostly multiple choice, although there were a couple of free form. And I promoted this survey on my blog, on Twitter, and LinkedIn. After a couple of months, 406 people completed the entire survey. Actually, 855 started, 337 dropped out. So there's actually a range in the number of responses, but 406 made it to the end and hit submit. But the others were still counted as well. It took people 9 minutes, and the distribution was pretty broad across the world. It wasn't just the US, but included a good chunk of people from India, Germany, Great Britain, and so on. The results are public, and you can go to this site or go to this link and you can see the results, and you're welcome to kind of dive into them. You know, trying to sort through survey results can be pretty challenging. You know, 400 plus responses, so many different factors. I'm not an academic trained in kind of survey analysis, but I think when you have 400 responses, it's kind of hard to argue against some trends. So let's get into some of these trends. I divided the questions after the survey into 5 different categories: tools, outputs, processes, API, and just kind of the general profile of the respondents. Let's jump into the first section, tools, because this is the section that I think most people are really curious about. I mean, tools in the developer doc space are hard to navigate. There are a ton of different tools. It's confusing to know which to use, especially for your API docs, how you integrate them with your tutorial docs, and so on. So the first question is, what is your primary authoring tool for creating documentation? And I had different categories. And the trending category is static site generator tools such as Jekyll, Hugo, Gatsby, Sphinx. And you can see some other trends as well. But 22% of the people is pretty interesting there. You can see that FrameMaker was only at 2.73%. So this varies pretty dramatically from those other surveys. I followed up this question with a free form question. You know, what specific tool are you using, rather than these general buckets? And you can see the number of responses. A lot of people use Confluence, Oxygen XML, Flare, Microsoft Word, Hugo, Jekyll. And I'll get into a little bit of the analysis of trying to sort through this answer in a bit. Another question: if you write content in a text editor, what editor do you mainly use? Most people use Visual Studio Code or Atom or just Notepad++. What's the most common source format? Markdown by far leads the pack with around 37%, followed by HTML and then XML. In general, do you follow a docs as code approach where you treat documentation similar to how developers treat code? And overwhelmingly, around 56% of the people said yes, they do. And this is a huge difference, right? This is a whole philosophy and methodology that's dramatically different from other tech-com spaces. What software do you use to create graphics and screenshots and visuals? Most people just use Snagit, but there are a lot of different tools people are using. And you can see a long list here if you dig through the results. What platform do you use to host and publish documentation, especially to provide continuous integration and delivery? And most people just use their company's own web servers or infrastructure to publish their documentation. I mean, there are some people using GitHub, GitLab, but by and large, people are just using the same infrastructure as their company's engineers use. What kind of computer do you use? Windows 54%, Mac 40%. So pretty evenly split. I mean, I kind of wondered if a lot more people were using Mac, but not so much. How do you manage your content? Most people manage their content using Git, 67%, right? So this is a huge category, right? Because Git is a complex workflow, or it can be. It's super flexible. It's the same workflow engineers use. And it's the primary way people are managing all their content, different versions, collaboration, kicking off builds and everything. All right, so now I want to reflect a little bit on how we unpack some of these responses about tools. I think they're different tools for different scenarios, right? You have a collaboration scenario where you're trying to collaborate on content with others and develop it. And in those scenarios, maybe you use something like Microsoft Word. You also have tools that you use for internal content. Maybe you know, docs just for internal teams, and maybe you use a tool like Confluence. Then you have another category of tools that you're using to assemble and publish out your content. And maybe you use a static site generator for that, such as Hugo. And then there's another category of tools that you're using to edit your content, where you write and edit, and maybe that's Visual Studio Code. And then another tool that you're using to manage your content, you know, push it and collaborate it and store it and so forth, that's usually Git. And then another category of tool that you're using to publish and deploy your content, maybe your company's own build system. So there's not just one tool that people use, right? And this is kind of the biggest takeaway is it used to be that kind of people in TechCom, you could identify what tool they were using, and that tool was an all-in-one sort of publishing, authoring, publishing solution, authoring, publishing, collaboration, all packed in one, kind of like a Swiss Army knife. But now there's not just a single tool for authoring, review, and publishing. You have a lot of different tools that are used for different purposes. And if you want to see some examples, check out this Jamstack site with some links. It shows all the different tools people use. And I also realized that the term tool itself is pretty ambiguous. You know, is the tool the editor? Is it the markdown? Is it the static site generator? Is it the build and deployment system? Is it the internal review tools? I mean, if you have 6 different tools you're using in your authoring and publishing solution, it's unclear what response you should provide when people ask, what tool do you use? And some people don't seem to be using any tools at all, right? If you're a developer working in the DevDoc space and your primary output is code annotations in the existing code, and you're just using your IDE, such as IntelliJ IDEA or your other Java IDEs and so forth, it's not really apparent what response these people should say when you ask them what tool they're using. It's like, no, I'm just writing Markdown as code annotations in my existing editor. I also found that a lot of people kind of treat Markdown like a standard, such as DITA. The tool is kind of irrelevant because it's used to sort of port the content from one tool or site to another. It's emerging as the standard that a lot of tools can operate in. I also think that one could make a case that the tools influence content. If you look at the history of authoring tools in the TechCom space, when people converted to the web, they started creating more articles. Before that, when they were writing big long PDFs, it was more of a book format. When people embraced wikis, they sort of had more feedback loops in the content. When people started writing in DITA, they had a lot of chunks of content that were kind of small fragments of the whole. When people adopted CCMSs, they started taking into account multi-channel scenarios. And now with this docs as code approach, I think we're seeing more developer collaboration and input. I have an article that you can read if you want more kind of exploration of this content. How you write influences what you write. It's kind of in my opinion, a controversial statement, right? You know, if you pick up a pencil, does the output of what you create with that differ from what you would create with a keyboard? You know, the same kind of concept. All right, so the emerging picture with tools is that writers primarily are using, for internal early content development, common tools such as Confluence, Word, Google Docs, but then they assemble and build their docs using a static site generator like Hugo, Jekyll, Gatsby, MakeDocs, and they work in an editor such as Visual Studio Code. They publish their content using a docs as code model with Git to trigger a continuous integration, continuous deployment model. often deploying on their company's own servers. And there's also a decent amount of wikis, Oxygen XML, and Madcap Flare use. Let's jump into another section of the survey, right? Outputs. I asked, what's the primary output format for your docs? And most people are publishing HTML on the web, but surprisingly, 23% are producing PDF. And this ties back to my initial reasons for doing the survey. I wanted to know, are people really generating PDF? You know, is that just a relic of the old TechCom space? No, people are actually creating PDFs. Do you create video tutorials or screencasts? Surprisingly, 28% said yes. And only 57% said no. Others are planning to create them soon. So there's a lot of people creating video. You know, I think there's a common misconception that developers hate video. I've had people stand up and be very adamant that we should never be creating video because developers don't want that. But it's not the case. Now, if you're not creating video and screencasts, why not? Well, some people just don't have the bandwidth, or the tech just changes so constantly that video goes out of date soon, or simply because nobody's asked for it. Another question, do your docs plug into a larger development portal? This developer portal, you know, organizes docs for a lot of different products, maybe has a unified search, navigation, other features that bring all the docs under one roof. And yeah, 56% of the people are pushing their docs into a developer portal. Do you localize your documentation? 73% do not, which is kind of astounding, right? If you don't have to include localization into your workflow, it frees up your tool set considerably. You don't have to really think more about XML tools because localization isn't a requirement. Another question about PDFs. Do you usually generate out PDFs and distribute them to your audience? I added another qualifier. And 57% said no, but yeah, 30% this time said yes, they usually generate out PDFs. And about 9% do create PDFs, but only for internal review. You know, the PDFs thing is interesting because a lot of these tool sets, the static site generators, don't generate out PDF by default. Sphinx is an exception. So by and large, this presents more complexity for technical writers if they have to generate out PDFs using Docs as Code tools. Did you play a significant role in developing and evolving your company's publishing solution? You know, maybe you helped design the site, the workflows, the strategies. And yeah, like 53% of the people said yes, they are building this out. Only about 20% said no, which is interesting because to build out a good-looking doc site using some of these static site generator tools is not trivial. It requires a UX skill set. So here's the emerging picture when it comes to outputs. Writers are primarily creating web content that fits into a larger developer portal. The writers often help shape and build both the publishing solution and the portal. And localization video tutorials and PDFs aren't overwhelmingly used, but they do constitute about a quarter of the output. Let's move on to a third category of the survey, processes. First question, how do you interact with engineering Scrum teams? And about 33% are embedded right on the same teams as Scrum teams. Another 27% are participants, but in a limited capacity. Maybe they're not counted as full-fledged members with points and demos and everything. Others, about 20%, have their own doc scrums. So this is a very common sort of pattern to organize TechCom work. How do you review your docs prior to release? You know, this question ties back to the PDF as well. And this is kind of amazing. 25% said that they use the same code review tools that engineers use to review software code. So these are your code diff tools. code review tools. And I tell you, this is a huge difference because reviewing documentation in a line-by-line editor is very different from adding notes in the margins of a PDF or a Google Docs type document. But about 13% use Google Docs or Quip. Others use Confluence. 12% use PDFs, and so on. Some people, a lot of people, 18% still use in-person meetings. And this will connect with a later question about the biggest challenges people have, and one of them is getting engineers to review the content they write. Does your doc publishing solution have continuous integration and deployment? For example, when you push your content to a certain branch with Git, do builds kick off on a server and push the docs out to production? And 47%, or 48% if you round up, said yes, they do. So this is actually a question just kind of checking previous question. 33% said no, but this is a huge kind of shift in terms of how docs are written and published. The ability to just kick off a couple of commands with Git and all of a sudden your files are in transit being deployed on the server a few minutes later is huge. It is huge. If you've ever had to manually kind of transfer and publish files, you know what a pain that is. Do you outsource any documentation to an offshore agency? No, 93% do not, right? And this probably speaks to the intellectual property concerns, especially if you're working with APIs and other kind of developer code. You probably want to keep that internal to the company. Do you have a style guide for your team that standardizes terminology and conventions about style, grammar, and syntax? 77% of the people said yes, we do. And this could be a style guide that you're just adopting from another group. Maybe you like the Microsoft Manual of Style or Google's Developer Style Guide. But yeah, people aren't just kind of going about it freely and choosing whatever styles they want. When you collaborate with engineers, how do the engineers contribute? Well, about 31% actually say that engineers contribute content through pull requests. Others, about the same number, 31%, say that engineers add content to a wiki or similar platform such as Quip and they grab it there. And about 22% say that engineers are direct authors in the version control repository. So an engineer pushes their code in Git just like the other technical writers might be doing. It's kind of an interesting model. I mean, if you look at why people adopt docs as code, it's really to unlock collaboration with engineers. And you can see that 22% of engineers at least are plugged in directly, and another 31% are committing pull requests. So yeah, I mean, if you're in this space and you're trying to get information from engineers, this tool set often allows people to collaborate. Here's the emerging picture, right? Writers participate on Scrum teams, sometimes in a limited capacity. They review docs using the same tools engineers use to review code. Engineers contribute through pull requests or through wikis. The publishing process is streamlined through continuous integration and deployment. And most content is generated within the company rather than outsourced. All right, let's move on to the fourth category in the survey, APIs. Does the documentation you work on usually involve some kind of API? And 81% of the people said yes. So I actually really like this question because I often equate developer docs with API docs. And it's true, not all developer docs involve an API. But here you can see that 81% of the time, yeah, if you're working in the dev doc space, it involves some kind of API. So in some ways, you can just use these terms, dev docs, API docs, somewhat synonymously. What's the most common type of API you work with? REST APIs, 56%. But Native library APIs such as Java, C++, these still constitute a sizable amount with 17%. And then a different number of different types of APIs trickle down, like SOAP APIs, only around 7%. GraphQL at around 7% as well. So it's interesting. Like the API landscape is really pretty broad. So how do you know what to focus on? Well, probably REST and then some native library APIs. If you're creating REST API docs, do you use the OpenAPI specification? And 47% of the people said yes. 16% said no. 15% said sometimes. And other people just aren't working with REST APIs. So this is a pretty strong trend, right? Like if you are going to be working with APIs, you should really know the OpenAPI spec because that's how a lot of people just document the API. How do you render the OpenAPI spec into documentation? Right now, some of these questions, I would probably unpack them more, but basically the OpenAPI spec is just a YAML or JSON format describing your API, and then you choose a different tool to pull that information and create an interactive, attractive display. And the most common one used is Swagger UI. Swagger usually refers to the tools around OpenAPI, and there's a free one that's been the standard for a long time, but Redoc is also heavily used with around 8.5%. And a good number of people use internally built tools, around 17% of the people. Do you primarily create the OpenAPI spec manually, or do you auto-generate it from code annotations? This is a huge debate kind of in the community of people working with OpenAPI, and it seems to be somewhat split. Around 22% manually create it, and 23% auto-generate it, and others do both. Who generates out the OpenAPI spec at your company? Primarily the engineers at 36%. The tech writers only generate this out around 6.5% of the time. But often both work on it, tech writers and engineers, around 25% of the time. So this is another key question. Now for reference docs, like Java Doc or Doxygen, who creates this content? Engineers usually create it 32% of the time, and tech writers 6% of the time. And there's some collaboration between the two, 27%. This is kind of interesting because, like, as a tech writer, you may wonder, am I responsible for the reference docs of this, or is that like an artifact engineers should provide as part of their development of the code? And you would not be out of place to just require engineers to provide the reference docs related to either a REST API or a Java API or C++ API. I think that's totally within the bounds of what would be common. You know, most tech writers typically are responsible for the tutorials around how to use that content, and the engineers might produce the reference. What are the most common programming languages you need to know? Well, JavaScript tops the list at around 24%, followed by Java at 18% and Python at around 16%. This more or less aligns with popularity of programming languages. Which of the following new or trending technologies are you documenting, or will you be documenting this year? So there wasn't any overwhelming answer. Some of the big, more common ones are machine learning, big data, AI, artificial intelligence, data privacy. All right, so the emerging picture here is that almost invariably, DevDocs involves an API, and it's usually a REST API. And when you're documenting the REST API, most people use the OpenAPI spec. Both writers and engineers collaborate as they generate out the docs using Swagger UI or a custom parser. And the most important languages to know are JavaScript, Java, and Python. Finally, this last section just has some profile information about the survey participants. The age range was surprisingly evenly distributed. It wasn't as if most people were young 30s or something and everybody else just trickled down. No, there was people all along the spectrum in somewhat even distributions. And the gender split was around even as well. I thought, oh, maybe because programmers tend to be predominantly male, maybe that would reflect in the tech writers. No, 52% male, 46% female. There were over 200 different companies. I didn't tally up to see who was the most, but we did have a lot of people from different companies. I think there were like 9 from Google and so forth, but it wasn't just like one company that predominated. As far as the college degree, 31% of the people have humanities degrees, 28% have engineering degrees, and 15% specifically have tech comm degrees. So this is a good one because a lot of people think, oh, if you want to thrive in API docs, you need to be a former engineer or you have to have an engineering degree. It's not the case. We got 45% of the people with either humanities or tech comm degrees that are working in this space, and around 75% of the people are satisfied with their job. This correlates with a satisfaction question that Saul asked in his TechCom census, and he found that about 72% of people are satisfied with their job. So it's roughly on par there. The team size, I wanted to know, are most people lone writers? They work in huge teams. 34% of people working in API docs are lone writers, and 31% are on small teams of 2 to 4 writers. And people who are working with 5 to 7 writers, there are 12% of those people. The employee type, almost invariably, 86% of the people are full-time. And I asked people, what group do you have the most affinity towards? Write the docs, STC, none. 39% said they feel most affinity towards write the docs. 14% said STC. A lot of people just don't have affinity towards any groups, really. How much time did you spend learning? Do you spend learning each day just trying to keep up? Around 28% of the people said 30 minutes. 27% of the people said 20 minutes, and 14% of people said 60 minutes. So finally, what are the biggest challenges you face in working with developer docs? Well, the technical know-how, understanding the developer technologies to the degree that you need to document is probably one of the big ones at 15%, 16% of the responses. But also just finding time, the bandwidth to create all this needed documentation, roughly the same. Around 15% of the people said this is a huge challenge. Another big challenge was getting reviews, getting adequate reviews to get the engineers to review stuff is a huge challenge. Around 15% of the people said that. And then another big trend here is trying to write docs that address both novice and advanced users. That's a challenge people run into. All right, so those are the results. And hopefully, as you're making your way in this dev doc space, these results give you some validation for maybe the path you're taking, or maybe you realize that, what we're doing doesn't seem to align with the trends. But I think understanding trends is helpful because you want to kind of choose your tool set and your processes and your formats to be generally in line with what's most common in that space. The skill sets people will ask for in job interviews will better match up. The expectations of the audience and the engineering teams in working with you will better match up. If you're kind of rogue and doing something completely different, kudos for innovation. If you're innovating, also recognize that you might run into more challenges trying to cut your own path through a jungle. So hopefully you can find some of these more well-worn paths and find more community, more tools available, more general information about those paths. My name is Tom Johnson. You can find more about me and my blog and API docs on I'dRatherBeWriting.com. And I've also got an extensive API documentation course you can go through for free on the same site. And feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Tom Johnson or through my email address, tomjoht@gmail.com. Thanks.
for great insights. And I've been involved in creating and processing large surveys before, so I know that you had to put a lot of work into creating the survey, collecting the results, and doing the analysis. And so thank you for that. There's a lot of insights in there that surprised me. And I don't want to not mention that now I have this image of the lone rider masked and riding a white horse. Of course, it's one of the HEPA masks that keep us safe during this time. We're going to now go into the Q&A session. There have been some questions that have been posed, and so if Joan can join us, that'd be great. I'll pose a question to Tom or Joan, and I'm going to try to alternate, even though that there are some good threads, because we're trying to limit this to about 15 minutes, and I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all the questions in that time. But I'm going to start with Joan, if you're ready, Joan.
Sure.
Okay. There's a question about, is there a best practice about whether resource names should be singular or plural?
That's a complicated subject. Sometimes plural, sometimes singular. So I'll give you some examples. So if we think of collections, let's say we have pet store, animals, cats, and then cat ID. We're working our way down to one thing. Okay, so then that one thing has nouns that pertain to it. That would be singular, like maybe collar, what type of collar they're wearing or what color they are. No, that's not a good one, color. But you could think of nouns where there's one thing pertaining to that one cat. Or owner, let's say, something like that. So, you know what, I'm hearing double. Where can I turn off the audio somewhere? But yeah, resource naming is a very complicated subject. You have to interview people and ask a lot of questions about future uses of the API, future possible endpoints that they might anticipate. So it's not an easy question to give one answer.
Okay, thank you for that. Tom, I was surprised by the number of people managing their docs in Git and following docs as code patterns and writers integrated in the development team. I'm curious if you've had a chance to look for correlations between happiness and integration, or in general, just correlations between the different conclusions and things that you saw.
I didn't correlate satisfaction with any type of particular setup in terms of whether they were integrated or not. So I really couldn't say. But I think in general, most people like to feel part of a team, right? If you're always the outsider, you're never really included in engineering scrum teams, you're bouncing from one group to another, and you don't have any team that really knows you well and that you feel a part of. Surely that can't be very comforting, So I think in general, people who are going to be more integrated will feel more included and more satisfied with their job, more needed. But it's definitely a challenge because, like, so many technical writers aren't dedicated to a single engineering scrum team or group. We have a handful, 5 to 10 or more, depending upon the size of your company. So we're bouncing around, trying to be included, but not able to fully, dedicate all of our time to one group. So it's a battle.
I'm a huge fan of having the writers as part of the team, and Lorena Poland commented here in chat, and I totally agree with that, that having the writers embedded with the devs give them a view of the work earlier and help them follow the work better, have better understanding, and it's just a much better collaboration. And when I've talked about Docs as Code before, I've talked about the need for documentation team members to earn the trust of the developers whenever they start getting in and fiddling with their tool chains. So the best way to build trust is to get in the deep end of the pool with them. So that's really great to see.
Well, I just want to follow up with that. One team I'm on asked me to start providing doc updates with their same code review tool as all the other software engineering updates, and we have like a web hook that pushes all this to our Chime chat, and it did make me feel more like one of the gang, having like doc updates appear in the code updates, and I think it built some credibility as well, right? Because it took me a while to figure out exactly how to do that, and but yeah, it was cool.
You got your scout badge for that, right? This one is for Joan. So Joan, in the process you described for API governance, where do you experience friction most often, and how would you suggest resolving that friction apart from testing the open API spec as you mentioned? And alternatively, is there an exchange point that you expected to cause friction and yet it goes smoothly?
Well, I'd have to say, for the first question, I'd have to say resource naming. Because there's the business of who owns the naming.
Yeah, and
then some people have to be explained, well, what name you're talking about. The resource name or the product name. And then somebody might decide, okay, this is who owns it. And the person who owns it maybe isn't an expert on REST. So maybe you divide up, okay, you get the first word, we get the next word, or something like that. It's political. Or people might see things a different way. You have to like look at it from the outside in rather than the inside out. And not everyone can do that, or they don't know what they're looking at. Are we looking at just this little team of engineers, or are we looking at the whole company? They can't like sort that out. So that, I would say, is the most complicated or hard, So it's like where I'm doing that, we're probably going to end up with a team that has different perspectives. And the other question was things that I thought would be complicated. Is that what it was?
It was.
And then they were not.
Was there an exchange point that you expected friction, but yet it went smoothly?